All right. Hi, everyone. Sorry, we're just making sure all of our settings are good to go. Okay. Welcome to this grand experiment. We weren't sure how was going to go, but we're glad that you're all here. And I guess we should start with some introductions. My name is JR Forasteros. I pastor down in Dallas, Texas, a little church called Catalyst. And I don't know, like I'm a pastor that has experienced with like what a lot of you have experienced trying to figure out what's going on with COVID-19 and social distancing. And so I love these other two pastors that I'm with today. And I was really looking forward for the chance to just pick their brains and kind of talk and see what would happen if we all sat in a room together, virtually, of course. I will love for you two to introduce yourselves and then we can get going.
Go ahead, Sandra.
Awesome. Well, I'm Sandra Van Opstal, and I am a pastor in Chicago on the West Side, and I'm the executive director of an organization called Chasing Justice. And I am here in Chicago just trying to thrive during this pandemic.
Here. Jose Humphreys, co-pastor at Metro Hope Church here in East Harlem. And Big Apple is known for many things, as we know. And unfortunately, we are the epicenter of the pandemic right now. So shepherding through that has been interesting nonetheless. But I'm really grateful for folks like Sandra and JR, who are conversation partners and offer wisdom that I think we could all use at a time like this. So grateful to be here, and also looking forward to just some Q&R, because while I don't have all the answers, I think there's something beautiful about the imagination and looking forward.
So for all of you who are watching, just give you an idea of how this is going to go. And we're not exactly sure because, like I said, this is a big experiment. We haven't really done anything like this. But if you're watching in Zoom, there is a chat feature. We're going to leave your cameras off and your microphones muted until the end when we do the Q&A. But feel free, if you have questions or comments, to drop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that while we're talking. And then if you're watching on YouTube, same thing. Feel free to use the live chat feature, and we'll be checking that over there. And then, of course, if you're on YouTube, and when we get to the Q&A, that'll be your best option for submitting questions that way. So again, we want to thank you all for being with us, and we hope that we can just figure out some profitable stuff. So I'd love to hear, especially since we're all in cities that have been pretty hit by this, how your pastoral work has transformed during the social distancing process. And I know that's like a super complicated question because it like changed minute by minute for a couple of weeks there and is still changing and will probably change by the time we're done with this call. But, Sandra, up in Chicago, what does it look like for you sort of on the ground doing ministry, both, I guess, in your local church context, but also in your work didn't you start Chasing Justice like right at the beginning of the pandemic?
Yeah. So let me tell you what I'm doing. First of all, I have two young children. So for those of you out there that have kids that you're, sharing the load of homeschooling, I, salute you, because I was never made to be a teacher. So that's why my husband has taken over most of the homeschooling, because he's much more patient than I am. So there's so many things I think that we're all doing right now. So I am a pastor I do pastor at a local church here in Chicago on the West Side. It's in a community, actually. It's really interesting because it's where a historically predominantly African-American community, like 90% African-American, North Austin, meets a community that's primarily recent immigrants from Central America and Mexico, and would fall under a either protective status, like refugee, asylum seeker, or undocumented. And so it's where those two communities meet, is where our church building is and where we do ministry. And the church, Grace and Peace, was historically and predominantly a Puerto Rican church. And for those of you that are on that don't understand the differences between different Latino groups, the Puerto Rican community is culturally very different than the Mexican and Central American community. And also their racial history is very different. And so you have this kind of Afro-Caribbean urban church that has whose neighborhood has changed and whose environment has changed. And now it's almost like a sandwich between Latinos, which we are, and African Americans, which we are. They are. I'm not Puerto Rican, but the churches. So, and then I'm Colombian Argentine, so I don't even fit in the picture anywhere. But it's this kind of really multi-ethnic, multi-class, multi-generational church that when I got there, it was about 70 people. And then we built our staff and we had just a season of incredible revival and growth. And we're probably close to about 200 now. And so, and then this pandemic, we moved into a new building, which is an old paint factory. And then this pandemic hit. And the majority of the work that Grace and Peace staff are doing, which I'm not included in, is the work of really being a food distribution and helps and resource center to the community. The reason I'm not there is because I have a son who has asthma and it's very bad. So I just can't be grocery shopping or out and about. I've just been at home. So the church's main thing, I think, has been to be a resource and a bridge between those both needs and assets that the community has and resources that are to be shared around the community. And so I think the church staff have done a fantastic job. The lead pastor, John Zayas, this is his element. Like, he's in his element. It's like, don't put him in an office to prepare a sermon. Like the sermon is being written while you're out there on the street, which is a different topic altogether. But so it has been an exciting time for the church, but it's a hard time for me as a pastor because I'm not in the midst of that, and I'm a doer. And I think that a lot of us as spiritual leaders, we're doers. We don't do well with sitting down and reflecting. And I've really just been asking God, like, what is it that you're inviting me to in this time where I can't do the same kinds of things I could do before? And so that's the church side. As far as Chasing Justice, yeah, Mark Reddy, who was working with World Relief and the director of the Justice Conference, actually, he and I started a new movement together called Chasing Justice, which we were going to launch in June, which is why we don't have a website up right now, hopefully next week. We were taking our time because we were building a team of younger leaders of color who we were kind of crafting a vision with, and just, I would say, we're being more conveners as leaders to see what is this lifestyle of justice that this next generation would like to see. And then the pandemic hit, and I'm going to tell you why we went live right away, was because what we started seeing was really mostly white male voices answering questions about how to live, survive, and thrive and pastor in a pandemic. And we felt like, no, that's just not possible. So Mark was like, let's go live. And I'd never done anything like that before. I'm not very good at those. I don't perceive myself to be a person that's good at those things. And he was like, we're going to go live, and Sandra and Kathy, you're going to start us. So we're just trying to give people a picture of what communities of justice are doing in a time of pandemic. And so we've just been interviewing friends. So that's where we're at right now.
Awesome. Jose, you're in East Harlem. So
right.
Like you said, like one of the big epicenters. What does pastoring look like for you and your team right now?
Wow. I would say it's the story of two things right now. It's the story of disorientation and also limitation. Because I think, similar to what Sandra mentioned, we're hands-on people. I'm bivocational. I work as a consultant / chaplain with an organization about 5 blocks down who works with returning citizens and court-involved youth. And when I think about not being able to be there hands-on in the same way, it's been really, really difficult for me to just kind of like stay put and ask some of the similar questions. What does love require of me, of us at this moment? I have a wife at home who's immunocompromised, and of course, I had mentioned to JR earlier, COVID literally hit home as my son was infected over 16 days ago. He's fine, thankfully, and we're trying to readjust as a family to bring him back out of his, video game land, which he was enjoying while he was in his own confinement. But I think our leadership has done an amazing job tech-wise, and seeing the laity just really rise up, which is, I think, a beautiful thing when we think about the priesthood of believers, that people are stepping up in terms of their generosity, leading prayer groups, and just doing wonderful things. And we started a benevolence fund, and we've been able to at least partner with the organization that I mentioned to provide things to essential workers that might need it. So I think we've been able to be creative, yet at the same time kind of abide within this sense of not hopelessness, but helplessness. and how do you process those feelings and develop a spiritual resource and resilience in the midst of that?
So my church, Catalyst, is in a suburb of Dallas. And it sounds like it's in some ways a few steps behind Sandra's community, in that we were largely a single racial demographic, in our case, white. And it is transitioning as Dallas is growing like almost unimaginably quickly. Our suburb is transforming demographically and just in terms of size. I think 3 decades ago it was about a third the size it is now, and it's now it's we're probably going to like max out because we're landlocked at about 100,000 people. But a huge demographic shift in the last decade as the Dallas public transportation has reached our suburb, as a tollway has gone through and stuff like that. So our church is really just having these conversations about how do we be a church that is truly multicultural, not just multi-ethnic, but how do we do all of that? And this kind of happened right in the middle of those conversations. And so again, we have just an unbelievable tech team and worship team that is helping us continue to do our Sunday morning worship. They figured out how to do it with fewer than 10 people, and so they're doing an amazing job there. So we've been focused more on how we can be good neighbors in this time. So, we got an idea from another church that, we created a downloadable card that our folks can print out and just fill it out and leave it on your neighbor's door that says, hey, here's my name, here's my number. If there's anything you need, if you are immunocompromised and you need someone to run to the store and get you some stuff, please let me know. So our folks have been using those. We've been doing some things like that. And then, we found that actually we are becoming sort of a haven for folks all over the country whose churches aren't able to do live stream worship for whatever reason. My mom lives in a small community in rural Kansas where their pastor is snail mailing his sermons to his congregation because most of them don't know how to get on Facebook or any of that, just because they're older. And so a lot of them have started tuning in and worshiping with us. So we found that there's a strange sort of, again, for a time, we're becoming a temporary spiritual home for a lot of folks that are being cut off. And so we've been really focusing on how to be present with each other. So we're, making sure that our small groups are operating. We got Zoom accounts for all of them so that they can be, connected to each other and seeing each other. And we've even been figuring out how to play games on Zoom, which is possible, but not intuitive, just so that our congregation can still play together. We feel like that, just being able to do fun things is part of what it means to live life and be spiritual together. And that's something that a lot of our folks are missing, is that ability to just recreate, with all of this downtime. I think, I don't know about everyone else, but I think I grossly misimagined what quarantine life would be like. I had these, visions of laying in a hammock in the backyard, reading books and, sipping from fruity drinks. And man, I'm finding it's not like that at all. I have found it very difficult to maintain any kind of routine. It's also really, it affected my spiritual practices. I was pretty good with a routine of, reading scripture and prayer that just went out the window in the first couple of weeks of quarantine, because it felt like I was in this timeless void where nothing had meaning. And it was like, what does it matter whether I do things now or later, because it's all the same. So I don't know. I'm curious how, for you as individually, both as a a person and a pastor, like how has quarantine affected your spiritual rhythms? Yeah, especially, again, I know both of you are in a house with young children, even without everything else going on. How does that, I don't know, how's that impacted you?
I think yesterday or today, I can't remember because they all run together. I turned to my husband. I was like, I don't know why I'm so tired, even though I'm sleeping so much more. I'm so tired. And I think I'm pretty good. Like I'm an ENFP on the Myers-Briggs. I'm like, have a really high EQ. Like I could tell you the 17 emotions I'm currently feeling all at the same time. Like I'm very in touch with myself emotionally. Have spent a lot of time feeling, being coached by a spiritual director to feel free to just name the emotion and put it out there, like not feel guilty for it. And, but I find myself almost like in a fog, of how I'm feeling until it comes up, and then I like scream at my children, or I cry on a interview, and then I'm like, oh, I feel like, oh, that was, or like my eye started twitching yesterday. I don't know if either of you have this, but like when you're stressed out, your eye just starts twitching. And I was like,
Yes.
oh, I'm trying to do this video for this Wheaton conference and my eye's all twitchy. And I'm like, oh, I need to like do something else. So I think part of it is, I don't actually believe we fully will understand the impact this time has had on us until it's passed. And I mean, I know that it's impacting marriages. So part of like pastoring, both for myself and pastoring, like my husband and I, we're going to marriage counseling video every other Wednesday or whatever. Like we're still doing it because we feel like the pressure of the experience is actually, it's stressful on a marriage. And so I think, and that could be everywhere from like congregants or neighbors in our community that we have that are in situations of domestic abuse to like just like more fighting for a couple that's just not used to fighting, and all of a sudden they realize, oh, we actually fight now. So I think there are some, just we've been on call for family matters, everything from neighbors to congregants and other spiritual leaders that are across the country that you'd think, well, they're on a platform all the time, they're fine. But the reality is they're not used to being home. Like I'm used to being gone. I'm not used to being here this much. And so I went from like last year, 70% travel because book launch, Jose. And then the next year it's like 60% travel. And now I'm literally at home all day long. I can't even ride my bike in the park, And I think that to give ourselves the space as leaders and as people and human beings to just go, what am I feeling right now? And I'm actually, interestingly, I'm writing I'm working on a book project on spiritual formation, on topic of spiritual formation while I'm doing this. I feel like every day I just like, I gotta write that down. I need 10 minutes to write that down because it's all live. All my bad sides are live right now. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is, and I'll just put this out for Jose. I don't know if you want to, but the other thing is like understanding how our deeply rooted cultural values, so not just our individual emotional intelligence, but understanding how our deeply rooted cultural values are being, what's the word I'm looking for? Not attacked, but like that's the first word I think of because I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. So they're being confronted. They're being confronted. So I think that a lot of people, even introverts that love being at home and probably would have stayed at home anyway had there been no quarantine, because we're Americans, it's like, well, you're telling me to stay home? I mean, this is my life. I get to do what I want with my life. So I think there's, whether you go and protest at a state capitol or whether your heart is protesting in your home, I feel like there's something in us that's like, I don't want to relax. I want to go outside, even though you probably would have stayed on your couch anyway. I think that the spiritual practice of addressing and confronting your cultural values and having high CQ or cultural intelligence, I think is missing from the discussion in the church right now. Like there are individual values or experiences, and then there are cultural values. So like Latino churches that aren't able to smooch and hug and grab your arm when they say your name, and now we're like on Zoom. I'm sorry, like we're probably dying inside and we don't even know it.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think I think that needs to be addressed in a way I don't think it has been.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Ditto. If I would add one thing, I think it's this kind of meta narrative moment where we're all like experiencing the same things in some form or fashion all over the globe, right? Uh, the last time that maybe that happened, even, and I would say this was more a North American thing, 9/11, where there was this kind of like collective trauma. Here, when we think about the pandemic, it's this slow moving event where we're disoriented. We don't know what time or date it is, right? You ever had one of those? Everything is just bleeding. Our roles are all just bleeding into one another as parent, as pastor, as counselor, as neighbor. And, you know, in New York City specifically, uh, we've heard stories, or I know of people, pastors who have passed away, people in my congregation who are infected with the virus while on a Zoom virtual prayer time. So we've been holding grief and loss in real time, and I think if what I'm realizing is that we're experiencing is what we're experiencing is this collective trauma, and it's happening, and I think that's an important thing for pastors, for churches, for people in general, to name. You know, I remember when my son was a toddler, and he crawled under the table and reach out for that toy, that ball, and you just know that on the descent up he might hit his head on the table, and sometimes of course he did, and you know, I'd be taken aback and just like, oh man, that's gotta hurt, or ooh, that's gonna leave a mark. And you know, we're in this collective moment right now where I'm realizing, where a lot of us are realizing, this is gonna leave a mark. This is reorienting the way that we are gonna live as society, the way that we see church, of course, which I know we'll get to in a few. And I think the most important thing to acknowledge is the very thing that Sandra was acknowledging now, like this is happening. And I am maybe in a sense of stasis, paralysis at times. And how do I hold this moment? And then how do I hold other people in this moment out of that space of limitation? That's going to be real important, because this is a sprint and not, this is a marathon, I should say, and not a sprint. And speaking on Enneagram, I mean, you know, they say that what they say about America, it's an achievement society, right? So if America is collectively like this 3 on the Enneagram, right? We don't feel productive enough. We don't feel, what's the big fight right now, right? Whether we should open up the economy, whether we should open up small business, survival of the fittest, let the weak die. Literally, people are saying that stuff. So, you know, you're seeing the real shadow side of that, I guess, you know, that typology in a sense. So navigating that I think is going to continue to be just a place of discernment, and also finding healthy practices.
So are there, maybe I'm kind of thinking on 3 levels right now. Are there practices that you have found useful as an individual, specifically as a pastor, and then also practices for your congregation?
Yeah.
That again are rebooting our spirituality, that are reframing our spirituality, that are helping us to live in the moment and name the moment and not try to rush past it. Sandra, you mentioned, like, you know, being attentive to how God is present in this time and not just sort of like waiting for it to be over so we can get back to normal. Like what spiritual practices are helping you do that?
You know, so I want to build off of what Jose was saying. And, you know, what's interesting in all of this is while we're all going through this together, we're not experiencing it the same because of our socioeconomic, racial location. Like if you're an Asian American experiencing pandemic right now, it's PTSD after this, because it's been, if you're an immigrant right now and our administration just said, whether you have a green card or not, you can't come back in, and you happen to leave the country because your mother died somewhere and you have to come back, then and this is personal for me because I'm in a family full of green card holders, so but it's and at the same time you're watching, so it's racially re-traumatizing many of us, because it's an anti-immigrant, anti-Asian, but also anti-immigrant kind of elevation. And at the same time, the statistics show us that 30 to 40% of all of our medical care workers are immigrants. And overwhelmingly, a majority of the people that are putting food on our tables are immigrants. And so they're actually giving people, undocumented immigrants, papers to move from their homes to their work every day to pick our fruit so that they can keep us fed. But then when this is all over, guess what they're going to do? They're going to discard us. And this is the same thing as the Forasteros that we already went through in this country. And so I think it's like, wow, here we go again, going through the same thing again. And I'm not in that experience. I own a home. Even if it is in our neighborhood, I own a home, I have an education, I'm not going to be, and I'm married to a white man that has generational wealth. I'm not going to experience that. But in my body, I'm feeling it for my community, in the same way that I'm sure, Jose, like for those of us that have family members or friends or communities that we work with that were formerly incarcerated or are incarcerated right now, it's really traumatizing, because we're seeing 70 to 90% of some prisons that are contracting COVID and they're not going to get the healthcare they need. And we're realizing again in this country, there are some of us that are disposable. We are just disposable, or we're commodities. They use us when they need us and then they throw us out. And I think that experience for even the most educated, wealthy person of color is so traumatizing. I think it's traumatizing. And yet at the same time, I feel so glad to be in a church of color right now, because the spirituality of walking around your house and yelling at God and crying out to God and asking for what you need and throwing yourself on the floor and dancing around when someone provides for you, that's that embodied mind, heart, and body of spirituality that's missing from the white church, for example, or from our more reserved Swedish friends, or I feel like I'm in the right place to be experiencing trauma because I come from a people of trauma. So in some aspects, I don't know if that makes sense. It's like in some aspects, I want to say like, we're not in this together because you're not choosing to care for me while we're in this. And at the same time, I feel like, man, I have something that you don't have. And you're feeling bad because you can't go outside and you can't even handle that. Like that's trauma for you. And I'm trying to be compassionate. My husband keeps telling me to be compassionate. But in my soul, I want to say that's because your spirituality is anemic. And this is the time for the church to actually choose mutuality and solidarity, because it allows us to gift to one another the resources we do have. You may have the resources to feed us rice and beans, because that's what we need right now. Amen. Anyone who wants to give to Grace and Peace. But we have the resource of a worship that will sustain you through this process. And so how can we practice that level of mutuality? And that's also a cultural and racialized reality that we're living in, not an individual, just me. So
that's right.
I don't know, Jose. Am I crazy?
Please. You're prophetic. And I think what I'm experiencing, I guess, as a person of color, is the whirlwind of those emotions. I was just sharing with another pastor yesterday that I was kind of racked with guilt for a while, because I tend to be hands-on. I tend to want to be in the mix, and this is one of those times when we can't. So I think the acknowledgement of privilege or relative privilege is a good practice, because I am not that person, right? And there are people, essential workers in particular here in New York City. If you watch New York one of our local stations, it was traumatizing for the first 2 weeks just to see that it's predominantly Latino and African American who are the essential workers, whether they're in the hospitals, whether they're the servers in the restaurants, the delivery people, and so forth, and seeing their pictures on the news, and just kind of taking that in and dealing with that just feeling of helplessness has been really rough. And I think what's been helpful is to think about and actualize ways of just walking with people through that in real time. You know, the person who, my friend who just lost his uncle in the South Bronx, who's been disproportionately hit, and then was attacked by his neighbor that same day because his neighbor apparently is so stressed and overwhelmed about life in his own apartment. So, you know, just the stories that we're navigating, I think, you know, I'm in total agreement with Sandra that there is this. That trauma takes on its particularities according to socioeconomics and race. And I would also say that this is definitely like this thing where we're going to be thinking about, you know, this sense of collective trauma, how people interact after this afterwards. So, yeah.
What is, I'm really captivated by this idea, Sandra, of, share, like you said, sharing our resources during this time. And I think from the direction of, you know, the people producing our food, or like Jose, like you said, the essential workers, to those of us with significantly more privilege, that's easy to see the flow that direction. You know, it's what we're used to. What do you think it looks like for the other direction? How do churches, especially right now, receive how do I want to say that? How do we receive the gifts of that group, like you were talking about in the embodied worship and the you know, that trauma right now? I mean, I think that's a difficult thing to see for a lot of churches that tend to be more privileged anyway, without a pandemic, and now in a time of social distancing, when we can't, I don't know, swap preachers or swap church choirs, or, you know, some of the things that I think we automatically reach for, and that when we can't do that right now, have you explored at all any ways to that might look before this quarantine is over?
Well, go ahead, Sandra.
No, go.
You know, I was talking about this with a woman pastor of color, and she's Latina, and we were Liz Rios, Dr. Liz Rios, you know her, Sandra,
Yeah.
and we were just talking about how the maladies of the American church, often the white church, is that it's ahistorical. People don't often talk about like whose shoulders they stand on, right? My mentors, right? I work with the guys and the women at Exodus, and always in the language is like, who were the mentors? Who were the people who saw us through, who prayed over us, the praying grandmas, the praying grandfathers, the elders, and those kinds of things. And I think what I've found great comfort and resources is just to reach out to my own mentors and my own elders and people and to kind of envision and see how they're actually coping with today's circumstances, because there's some history there, but there's also a deeply grounded spirituality of suffering. And I think that's the hugest lesson that I've been drawing forth from, and I've drawn over time, even before COVID, is just that, you know, in our triumphalistic theology in our society that is often privileged and disconnected, we do Resurrection Sunday really well. But this last Resurrection Sunday was an interesting sermon for me. One of the most difficult sermons I've ever had to preach, because I have people who are experiencing loss in real time in my congregation. In the Zoom gallery view, I'm looking at all of these faces, and you know, from poor to more rich, essential workers to highly educated, the highly educated doctor who is also infected, who is Latina, right, from Brooklyn, and is putting garbage bags on her person because they don't have enough equipment. So, you know, this is the reality that we're preaching to, And I really do think, I don't think it's like, what practice should I take on? I really do think that this is a tectonic plate. This is like underneath the surface. It's a formative thing where we as a people, we as Americans really need to re-examine our theology and go back and to think about how it is it that this theology of suffering, this theology of disorientation, right? Brueggemann talks about the Psalms, right? Orientation, disorientation, reorientation, that we're in this like disorientation period right now. And our discipleship does not really address in many ways this idea of disorientation, or we want to get it over with. But I found on that Easter Sunday that learned through my elders, once again, that there was this amazing experiential intersection in my own theology of those things, of looking at the empty tomb in the shadow of the cross, and those two things present at once, as opposed to this linear thing that just leaves Good Friday behalf. And it's one of those things that where we want to ask the question again, right? Paul's question, as people of color, as people of privilege, as etc. How do we get to know God in this? And it happens two ways, right? In the power of resurrection and in the fellowship of suffering. And I think once we learn or continue to learn how to sit with that, then I think some answers or responses will come out of that. But I don't know if that's something that people can just be like, what practices should I adopt and who should I talk to?
It's interesting because I so much of what you said, it feels like you're well, I haven't journaled, so if you had journaled, you would have been reading my journal, but I haven't. And I also haven't been preaching during this time because I was not scheduled to preach because I was supposed to be traveling. I was supposed to be in Africa for the month of April. So Resurrection Sunday was interesting for me, all of Holy Week, because I was experiencing it as a congregant and as a mother and not as a pastor. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's was a very different experience for me. And I think to answer that, I think the reality is that we gravitate for the spiritual practices that we understand and know. So the real question here is, what diversity of spiritual practices do we as believers have? And I can say for myself, like having grown up in a Latino Catholic home, I have a set of spiritual practices that I took on as they're foundational to who I am. And then having kind of come to like faith awakening in a white Baptist church, like Southern Baptist church, I have another set of practices that I got to adopt. And then, having been in a part of InterVarsity with its fantastic inductive manuscript study, which still outbeats my seminary education every time for sermon prep. I have a love for the word and for allowing the word to not just be something I reflect on, but something I understand and dig into and develop. Everything has to have kind of I feel like a theological paper under it. Like every move I make has like a paper attached to it in my mind. And all those things have become a part of my spiritual journey. And so, I'm not, I go to the things I understand. So lament is not something that was taught to me because I read it in a book and now I do it. And I have like to be coached through it and led through it. It's something I understand because I watched my family. I watched the mothers of our church. I watched the men in our community lead through, like naming something, give it a name, like, what do you feel? Admit it, give it a name. And then know that even though you stand in that grief, because it's not going to go away, overnight, that God is with you in that grief. And so the ability to name something as wrong or evil or painful, or, even if it's something very tender, which H don't usually do, but there have been times in the last couple of weeks where I felt very, like rejected, like rejection is the word I would use for it, which doesn't make sense really for what I'm doing necessarily, but it's how I feel. And to be able to name with my spiritual director, with my husband, I feel rejected because of that. And it's not going to master me, but I want to give it a name. It's called rejection. And that was not taught to me by these other spaces. It was what I grew up in. So I think that we have spiritual practices that we lean towards. Like the other day during a small group, we had a Zoom call, and one of our community group members was this terrible personal thing happened to her in the midst of all these other financial and, systemic things that are happening and the pandemic. And, she was sharing with us how she just was going around the house, just like crying out to God and screaming. And, the little kids that she watches were like, what's going on? Words of mine. I said, I can't remember the last time that I did that. Am I okay? My internet's okay? And it's because I have privilege now that I didn't used to have. So I'm in a socioeconomic reality that I didn't grow up in. I'm in a career reality that life is aligned in such a way that I'm pretty comfortable. So my kept me from kind of cry that I used to have for all the things, even in the issues of injustice that I'm trying to see reform in. So I felt kind of sad, I felt like, ooh, like I want to be in that place again, like not going through hardship, but where the hardship of my brother or my sister drives me to pray the same way. So I think in like responding to some of what Jose said, I think it is a theological, it's experiential. Like we have the practices we have because somebody shared them with us. That's why I think we need mutuality, because we're limited to our own practices. And I would say that across all cultures. And then the other thing is we're living in theological, like we live out of our theology. So we practice out of our theology, which means that if you were taught to come to Christ because Christ is your personal friend and because Jesus wants to save you, and if there was no other person in the world anywhere, God would still have died for you, like if that's your theology, then when crisis hits, and you have an entire country, an entire generation of believers that's like, this is about me and preserving me, and my worship only accentuates that life is about me. So how then do you expect people that have been raised up in that theology and that worldview, which is very syncretistic, it's capitalism plus individualism plus triumphalism equals Christianity, how do you expect those people not to fight for their own rights, even though they're going to be hurting the most vulnerable, or to say, sacrifice the weak for the good of all? I believe that person holding that sign was a Christian. I really do. I mean, I don't know if they actually know Jesus, but I believe they would claim to be a Christian, because that's that is the natural end point of a theology that is introduced to you, that Jesus is about you. It's a theological problem. And I think that those theologies give us the practices that we have. That's why we see so many of the most vulnerable and so many of the most people that have the most to lose giving the most, because they're used to it. They don't have a theology of scarcity because they've never had anything. So what I have today, God gave to me, and if I give it away, God will give me more tomorrow. It's actually the wealthy and the privileged who have a theology of scarcity. That's why we need each other.
I'm an Enneagram 3, so yeah, I've taken this quarantine very personally, because I'm not. I remember like immediately the first week that I was trapped at home, I was like, what are all the things that I can start doing on the internet to prove that I'm still valuable and worthy of attention and affection, right? That's the classic 3 thing. And my spiritual director challenged me. This has been a while ago, but it's something I'm still struggling to really implement well. Specifically for me, and I don't know, probably this is a reflection of my own position and privilege. Like the practice that I need to embody is to just sit with God, not reading scripture, because that's a thing I can do. Not even like actively praying, because that's a thing I can do, but really just to sit and receive God's attention and affection and rescue. And that has been a struggle for me. Because again, I think it cuts to the core of the sort of syncretistic Christianity that I was raised with, Sandra, that you were just outlining, that it's all about me and that I can do it. And, look how, let me perform my spirituality for you and prove that I'm worthy. And it's something I still find myself, I feel almost like an animal caught in a trap when I'm doing that. Like I'd rather gnaw my own leg off to get away than just like sit and have to be loved without being able to do anything to earn it. And so, oh,
I think that self-reflection is very helpful because, and I so wish, like when I started working with my church, I got a grant from our denomination to do spiritual formation and kind of leadership development. And I remember when we first started meeting with a spiritual director and going through the Enneagram work. I mean, it was like so hard for us to close the doors for like a couple hours once a month on Thursday. Like people just felt like, oh my gosh, but there's stuff to do. And I really felt like reflection should not be a gift just for the privileged. It should be something practiced by all of us. How it's practiced might be different. How a single mom practices reflection might be different than, how someone who has help, might practice it. But I think that idea of quieting your soul enough to see what surfaces to the top, it's very important, because what surfaces then can be addressed, and then we can give it a name. So I only was able to go, oh my gosh, I feel rejected, because I was still enough to go, oh, there's like a world, and I'm an 8 with a 7 wing. So it's like the more the merrier, and the bigger the better. And I'm, how could Jesus probably save the world without me? Like, it's terrible, and here I am, like, I have to stay at home. I can't help at the church. I can't see people. I can't and all the things, all my speaking engagements, my trip to Africa, everything's canceled. And now I just got to be here, and I think the Lord really, and my spiritual director had said to me, so I'll share this to you. Sorry, it's public, but my spiritual director said to me, why, instead of being so concerned about the invitations everybody else is giving you or not giving you, why don't you ask, why don't you reflect on the fact that Jesus is inviting you? Like, why is that not where you're? And I was like, oh, I felt so exposed, like, oh my gosh. And it wasn't for the same reasons as maybe someone with your social location or personality, but it was a brokenness that I needed to address. And the other thing she asked me was, how is your calling working out for your family? For the business of your family. That's what it was in Spanish, but she said, how is your calling working out for the business of your family? And I was like, here, my husband's telling me, like, I feel neglected, and here I think I'm saying no to so many things, and it's still not enough. And so all those things kind of came together right before the pandemic, like in February. And I was like, what a perfect time to do nothing.
That's
right. And I'm still working. We're all working. We're not sitting at home like eating Cheetos and watching Netflix, but this idea that we're chasing some kind of something, some satisfaction as leaders outside of the very reality that we're created in God's image and that God loves us regardless of what we produce for him, that's a sickness that has to be dealt with. And I'm really hoping that I can lean into that during this time. But now I'm, the marriage counselor's like, how you guys doing now? Because you have a lot of time together. And Carl's like, oh, we're doing really good. So I don't know if that, but I think the reflection is good, right? I mean, we don't want to not care for ourselves.
Yeah.
But I do think that we have to reflect on the theology that has shaped our practices.
Yeah. I for one need to get out of my head, and I think the reflection piece can be paralyzing, but necessary. And I think what we're all speaking to is this recognition that there are spiritual practices that may have worked for us before. JR and I were talking about, I haven't been able to even finish a chapter in a book to read. My concentration is just like so off. So I find that the collective practices of the church, the tools of our trade, in many ways have anchored me. And so we just take prayer on some generic level, the power of it. How does it translate contextually for us to be able to reimagine what church after COVID can be, while at the same time sitting with the present moment? So, for our church, we been able to, we were doing virtual prayer last July, interesting enough. And it seemed it was working, it was okay, but it made sense after COVID-19. It didn't make sense before, but it made sense after COVID-19. Why do virtual prayer? We get some folks. It's okay. It's been working out. And then as we were at the cusp 2 weeks ago of going into the apex of the pandemic, we realized, oh, people really need spaces and moments to be able to process that. Once again, using the tools of the church's trade. And so we have a kind of an ecumenical group in our community. Some hold on more to the liturgical, others are more charismatic and come from that tradition. So we readopted I guess, ancient future, the offices. And so we have a morning prayer, and that's 15 minutes. No, it's a half hour actually. And it gives us an opportunity to read scriptures and also do affirmations. The afternoon crowd is a little bit different, 15 minutes, and it's more liturgical, scripted, prayer of St. Francis, Beatitudes, and it's the same and it's predictable. And then in the evening at 8:30, you'll find more of the charismatic, we call it intercessory prayer, right? And I think Walter Wing talked about how intercessory prayer infuses the time, the suffocating moment. And in the midst of a suffocating moment, overwhelming present, like Paulo Freire would say, right? Because that's what it is where things are feeling so confined. I thought as a pastor, and this was my limitation, and this is what the spiritual practices had taught me. I thought that if people shared their grief consistently, like every day, it would just take us all under. And somehow within, I guess, the mystical, charismatic, Pentecostal, if you will, manifest presence in those moments, what we found is that we were able to face our grief honestly and realize that it's not everything. Somehow the practices were able to ground us in a very overwhelming present, but also let us leave feeling buoyant, as if we could see a lot more, experience a lot more of God's expansive grace. So I think to Sandra's point, and your point as well, in terms of, there's certain practices that we grew up with. How do we engage them theologically in a way that's more faithful to a fuller gospel that incorporates both grief and loss, Good Friday, and also resurrection, and hold those things in tension?
So we've kind of already been hitting around it, but one of the things that we really wanted to talk about in this webinar is, whenever we get to the other side of COVID-19, which, could be summer, some people are saying 2022, which let's hope not, but, if it is, it is. A lot of people are saying they can't wait to get back to normal. But Sandra, when we were even emailing back and forth about this, you said right away, we don't want to get back to normal. We want to do a different, the normal that we would be going back to wasn't good all the time. So I'd love to hear just some of our thoughts on what are some things that what are some seeds maybe that you're beginning to see take root that could shape a new goodness for the church and a new normal that's more just, that's more whole gospel, Jose, like you were saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the invitation that we have and the opportunity that we have is massive, because we've come to a place where however we were comfortable in our complicity with how things are going in the church, we now have an opportunity to pivot and to change, So whether it's our young people saying we don't like this, the way we're doing church, we're like, okay, well, how do you want to do it then? Because it's all up in the air now, or whether it's, how much time do we spend on this versus how much time do we spend on this, and what's more critical? It's all of it should be up in the air. Literally, we should say, what does it mean to be the church? And that's why I went back. I'm in a doctoral program at North Park. Fuller has a program that Dr. Soon-Chan Ra runs. And so I'm writing my manifesto basically for chasing justice. And what does it look like for this next generation of the church to lead us to a place of more flourishing and just practices for the church. And I reread a book by Dr. Zach Ndinge, who's a Ugandan scholar and pastor and bishop. And it's InterVarsity Press. It's called The Church, the Pilgrim People of God. And it's really asking, like, what is the nature of the church? And as I was reading it, I was thinking, like, what a great opportunity to actually become like this church that he's describing here, because this is not what I see in a majority of churches in the US right now, or in North America. And so what a great opportunity for us to go, oh, maybe we're not doing things right. And then actually turn to the majority church, which is 89% of the church around the world, and say, hey, how do you think we should be the church? You know, and to turn to urban churches and immigrant churches in our country that are experiencing revival and are experiencing growth and aren't the statistic that we're hearing about, quote unquote, the church, and saying, like, how are you guys doing it? Because this time of pandemic, you got to really see, like, my friend Pastor Paco over there in Little Village on the west side of Chicago, he wasn't like, how do we build a system to help the neighbor? Because he's already in relationship with his neighbors. The church already works with youth that are re-entering society, and with mothers that are in situations where they need to find work, and tutoring, and they're already doing all of that. So instead of a church that doesn't have that, saying, how do we create a system that best helps our neighbor? Why didn't they call Paco and have him like on 100 webinars on, like, what does it mean for a church to be the church in a community? And so I think the opportunity was there. Sadly, I don't really think that the competent U.S. church feels it needs the rest of us, but I'm just, maybe it's an opportunity to listen to some new voices. That's why for us, for Chasing Justice, like by week 3 of our daily lives, we were already like, let's make sure that our global friends are talking to how it means to be the church, what it means to be the church in this pandemic, and a neighbor, because they're doing ridiculously creative things, and we have a lot to learn. So I think my hope is, like, my kind of hope for the new normal is that all of the people that have said, especially our progressive white friends, all the people that have said, like, oh, we really need people of color, we really need churches of color, we really need to center the voices that have been on the margins, but actually right now they're literally ignoring us and building their own systems of responding to the pandemic with their own IG lives and their own voices and their own books and their own, literally, this is the time to do it. And I'm sorry, but they're not. And so I'm like, I'm hoping, but I'm just like not convinced. So so I'm going to say this. I confess yesterday, and I'll confess again today, that I've been watching the Netflix show Anne with an E, because I'm escaping from my reality. And it's about Anne of Green Gables. So Canadian farm girl, red hair, totally not my life at all. And my husband's like, why do you like these British shows like Downton Abbey? And I was like, why do you watch these? Like, you literally hate, like, everything the English have stood for historically, and like, all their colonizing theology and all, like, you're literally like watching these shows. I said, I think it's because in church history and in world history and in all the things I'm reading for my doctoral program, it just feels like nobody's good. And in Anne of Green Gables, this old couple, like, adopts her, and people call her trash, and they say all these really mean things to her, but she somehow finds it in herself to use her experience of marginalization to advocate for the indigenous folks that are being, like, put into the residential boarding schools in Canada, and the Trinidadian friend that comes with this, like, all the characters in this, the woman who's too feminist that no one likes because she's got progressive women ideas. But this girl, Anne, and her parents, who were very conservative, they somehow became the type of people that made a difference in their community and made a difference for those who had been shut out socially. And I think I find some kind of like, oh God, please, I pray that the church would be the Anne. Like, I pray that we would be able to change, like able to pivot, able to repent and say, we've been doing this wrong. So what does it mean to take our lament and our grief and utilize that to center the most vulnerable? And I think that this next generation is looking for a church like that. The statistics and the research proves that. So I hope we don't go back to the way things were. I really hope we don't, but I'm not convinced that we won't.
It's like, yeah, I'm afraid there's going to be a lot of theological muscle memory. you know, and then when we jump back into the buildings again, it'll be like, oh, okay, like now we can just, you know, and all the old patterns and all the old grooves will still be there. And it'll be, I think even for churches that desperately want not to do that, it'll be really easy to just like slip back into the way things were and do it, even if that's not good, even if the things they've discovered to do during the pandemic have been better. You know what I mean? Like it's just such a dangerous temptation. Jose, what about you? What are some of the things you're looking forward to, change wise?
I think the question about hybridity has been in my mind because you know the virtual platforms have allowed us to do things that we otherwise wouldn't do, and I think you know while whether you're doing prayer virtually and prayer in person, which I think you know is the preferred form of prayer, what what I see is that there's been an intimacy that has formed through prayer time together. Uh, People praying in Spanish and praying in the way that they know how. You know what I'm saying? According to native cultural tongue. Uh, you know, people using the resources of the Lord's Prayer. And I think I say all of that to say, I think that my church is in the planning stages or the thinking stages, just kind of throwing it out there. It's just like, what does this look like when uh, we touch down and re-enter? What are the things that we should keep going as a church community? How will we avail ourselves of this moment in a sense to not only reconnect but to be the church during a time where there's just going to be a lot of uncertainty going back in. So I would say just a couple of things. Uh, I think we've been looking at like how do we instead of drawing a crowd, how do we hold space differently in a way that's trauma informed, in a way where we can begin to engage even our embodied practices. Those have actually helped me, like, you know, doing yoga, walking the dog has been, you know, oh, this is a big deal, you know, just getting out of the house and being in my body. And it's something that I think pastors and Christians in general need to be looking at, like because evangelical traditions and faith have always been in many ways more confessional and in some ways disembodied. I think this is a real good opportunity to think about like how is it that we are going to you know, whether it's, you know, looking at the broken bread and communion in a way that's different, whether it's virtually or however you think about that theologically, like we're going to be looking at these things differently, touching them differently, and also storing them, telling a story about them differently. You know, for we had another example of a practice that we'd like to take on besides the daily offices, right? In whatever expression that could look like in the future. We had a supper together, a Zoom supper. And I was telling my wife, I don't know how that's going to go down. What are we going to just stare at each other and just eat? And my wife was like, yeah, you know what I'm saying? And, you know, it translated us out of that like New York minute. And we were just sitting there with each other. What a concept! Where, you know, without you know, just this heavy agenda driven time, and started talking about movies that we liked. And, you know, what in the midst of our disorientation right now with COVID, in the midst of our loss of kind of time and space, orientation of time and space, which is actually just a symptom of trauma in many ways. How is it that we re-enter the story of society with a story that can ground us in moments that in many ways couched with just eternity? We stop, we feel the presence of God, we break bread, we learn together, we look at time differently. So, you know, those are the things that I'm kind of thinking about going forward, you know, like taking these vital transformative moments that are happening in real time, the testimonies, there you go, el testimonio, como decimos en la iglesia, like how do we continue those in a way where you know, the church can be a hybrid expression and a more faithful expression of the community of Christ going forward.
I have so my church I've mentioned is in a suburb, and I have a like a love-hate relationship with suburbia. And one of the cultural qualities of suburbia that I really despise is the disembodiedness. We have no front porches. We have big privacy fences around our backyards. Everyone's a commuter. And our community in particular is a bedroom community. It's changing, but historically it has been a place where people sleep, and that's about it. For everything else, they go somewhere else besides this community. And in many ways, our church has been a reflection of that, where we gather on Sundays, and then hopefully you're in a small group, but largely we're separate throughout the week. And one of the things I've seen our people craving is that togetherness. I think they're recognizing, and not for the first time, but I think in a deeper and in a fresher way, how important that embodied worship together is. And we stream on YouTube. That's how our church does worship, and the live chat has just been tremendously fun because folks just want to connect, and so they're talking with each other, they're making jokes about the sermon, or they're shouting out to the worship team, even though the worship team can't see them till church is over and they go back and look, because again it's reflecting this like deep need to be together and to celebrate together. And going forward, that's one of the Sandra, I think you were the one that used the language like, how can we reimagine our cultural script or something like that, right? Like how can we as a church have a spiritual imagination that really challenges how we are, not just as believers together, but in our larger culture, in our particular space and time. That's something I'd really like to see our church challenge, is that disconnected, disembodied, a la carte spirituality, where like a sermon that you download into your podcast app and listen to on your commute isn't actually the same as receiving teaching together with a body of people that you're regularly sharing physical space with, not just on Sundays, but throughout the week. Again, I think that's a deep need that our particular community has. And even our city government is trying to figure out ways to address that, which is great. I'm all about if the government and the church can be on the same page and working towards more equitable spaces, all the better. But that's a particular thing that I'm looking forward to us, and that's one of those things that I'm worried is going to be a muscle memory thing. Like the first month that the pandemic is lifted or it is over and we're all able to be back together is going to be amazing, but it's going to kind of slowly flex back into the old way. Is something I'm honestly really concerned about, and trying to figure out, how do we create a new normal, and how do we celebrate something that is, I think, more healthy and more whole spirituality, more full gospel. I think the economic realities that both of you have raised also really trouble me. I mean, we see that in our own church community to a degree, with folks that have been laid off or folks who are deemed essential and all of that. And I don't know, I'm sort of at a loss for how our churches can imagine something different in a really tangible way moving forward. Is that something either of you are experimenting with or thinking through? Or
I mean, I think a lot of it just, again, goes to how we understand ourselves as a part of God's family. I mean, it's like basic, like Sunday school gospel reorienting, like, and I really like, Jose, what you said about, because I'm a Brueggemann fan, and I think about that process of orientation, disorientation, reorientation. And I really like the disorientation. Like, I'm all about that. So I'm not one who orients people. I'm one who shows up when you're disoriented and says, I'm so glad you had to go through that. Now let's figure out a new way together.
Sandra, as an 8, don't you also like to disorient?
Yes, I also like to bring disorientation. So I'm sorry, did you think we were in this together? Let me tell you why. So But it's not because I like to be mean. It's because I know that when we're in those spaces where our whole lives get shaken up, that we have an opportunity to choose something different. We can choose. I posted this yesterday on the Chasing Justice Instagram, but it's one of my favorite quotes from Emmanuel Katangale, who writes so many books, but he's a Catholic theologian, Ugandan also. He says, inventing the future requires reshaping the present according to a vision of a future yet to be born. So if you want to invent the future, reinvent the future, you have to reshape the present according to that future that hasn't yet been born. And I think I was reading some books last night with my kids. They're 5. And it was about Trillia Newell wrote a book called God's Very Good Idea. And it's really good. It's like a kid's book about the gospel. And the way it talks about the gospel is that God's invited you to be a part of this family where there are different people, some that ride bikes, some that like to read, some that have curly hair, some that, it's kind of like a kid's, and that God's intent was that this very different group of people would become a family and that they would show God's love to the world. And I felt like that's the gospel. Like that's a different way of them, like God saw you and he just liked you. And so he picked you. That's why I like the book, and I think that it's about kind of practicing things now. So I would say on a very practical level, we tried to give some questions and kind of run an idea on Chasing Justice last week when the stimulus checks were coming out. But my basic call was like, hey, if you're making a collective income of $75,000 or $100,000 in your household, you don't need that stimulus check. Like figure yourself out, because most of our countries poor are living off $16,000 a year. So when the money comes in, because you didn't budget for it, and you're still working at home, take the check and just reroute it back out to small businesses or organizations run by people of color, because we're underfunded and underrepresented. And so I just gave a bunch of ideas of like what you could do. And that is a spiritual act of worship. Redistribute your stimulus check. Because the way that our government did that stimulus check, it excluded certain people. Like, for example, if you file taxes with a TIN instead of a Social Security, or apparently now if you are married to an immigrant. So, so I think there are very tangible, practical things. The money you would have spent eating out, because especially so many of our millennial churchgoers eat out so much, like that's a whole, sport, instead of doing that, why don't you rebudget that money to give to a food bank that's distributing food to those who are most vulnerable in your community? Like a friend of mine in their small group, they said, during our small community group time, we're going to write letters to youth and men that are incarcerated because they can't get visits right now. And it was organized by some folks at the North Park School of Arts and Restorative Justice, but the small group took it and said, we're going to do this as a small group. We're going to invite our friends to do this. And then a few of them, a handful of them, wrote letters and did the drive with us around Stateville to petition for compassionate release for those who are immunocompromised, not risk to society, et cetera, et cetera. So it's moving the small group from praying about those who are vulnerable to giving, speaking up, moving, showing up. And I think that those are very tangible things in different, like let's say your church is not ready to talk about immigrants or those who are incarcerated. That's fine. It's a different story. But there's foster children who are being affected right now by this. Who doesn't love foster children? So I don't know. There's just a fund in your church for those who have mental health issues to be able to continue to see their counselors. There's so much we could be doing if our theology was my flourishing is wrapped up in your flourishing, because we are the body of Christ.
Yeah,
I love that.
Amen. Goes right there.
Jose, any final thoughts, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A.
Yeah, I'll tail off with the economy piece. I think it's a real good time to develop the practices, be creative around the practices. I'll add a couple more. Tipping generously for those who are basically keeping the economy alive in so many different ways. You know what I mean? And the people that are resourcing us staying at home, literally in so many different ways, like tipping extra generously, just above and beyond. I think is a really good practice. And then when you think about just to root it theologically, I think it's helpful for people to once again realize that recognize that theology of economics, that whatever God gives us, it's God's hands through our hands. So what hypercapitalism really just shows us is that the gift stops, and it stops with a few, especially now as we see. So how is it that we can, as the body of Christ, think about how, lean on indigenous wisdom that says that the gift must keep moving. The gift must keep on circulating, because our flourishing, right, as Sandra mentioned, being tied into my flourishing, being tied into someone else's flourishing, really deals with ecology. That are we really seeing ourselves as an ecosystem? Because if we really saw ourselves as part of God's ecology and God's ecosystem, then it wouldn't be so easy for people to take up picket signs in different parts of the country and say, I want to rush back to whatever it is, whatever life, or my freedom, my liberty, my hyper individualism, whatever leanings people may have. And I think, we're all contaminated with at least that strand at different degrees as Americans, as someone of color who was born in America. So that's something that I consistently have to go back into my own indigenous thinking and biblical thinking as well, as like how is it that although I'm confined, although some of us are constrained, how is it that we can continue to be creative with allowing the gift to move? And I think Sandra brought up some great examples of that, so I don't need to double down on that.
She's also dropping a wealth of resources in the chat, it looks like. So if you're not paying attention to the chat, turn that on. Okay, so we promised some time for Q&A, even though we went long. Big surprise if you know any of us. But you are now able to unmute yourselves. So I turned on that feature. So if you do have a question or a comment you want to engage, you're welcome to turn your camera on, unmute yourself, drop in. We'd love to hear from y'all what you think, what some of your big takeaways are, big questions you still have.
I want to give a shout out while people are figuring themselves the questions out to the taking care of your body. Jose brought that up yesterday. Like I hate yoga because I like Zumba, but I can't go to Zumba classes right now. So my husband's making me do yoga every night, and it's helped so much. It's helped so much because especially there are some personality types that experience stress in their bodies. And without being able to go into the park for a bike ride, and now I'm investing in like this thing that you attach your bike to, so you just ride in place like a hamster, because I can't go to the health club, but it's worth $100 to me because I need it, because I need to not like yell at my children. And I tried to ride on our city streets, but no, it's just not possible. So I think taking care of your body, eating well, like treating your body as well as you can eat without going to the store for like 1,000 vegetables. Just treating yourself well, I think, is sleeping, not like going into a comatose state on Netflix or Hulu. I think I'm just talking to myself, but it's really easy to go to those places and just kind of even like yesterday or one day this week, I just shut down my family. I was like, I need to leave me by myself. And I just watched like 4 hours of Netflix. And I was like, that was not healthy for my soul. Actually, that was not life-giving. But I was looking for something and I didn't know what it was. And I think I'm trying to find those physical practices of, I have a happy hour every Friday with my friends, ladies across the country who do the kind of work I do and are also moms. And we just talk about life and, share whatever cocktails we had that week. So we're going to pick a cocktail and just have a drink and share and laugh and cry and, show our dirty houses to each other. And I think whatever those things are, you have to find something that takes care of your body. So.
Yeah. Our counselor at our church, we have a couple of counselors on staff, and we did a webinar a couple of weeks ago about like just how do you stay mentally healthy during this time. And one of the things he said was like, make a schedule and stick to it. Have a bedtime, have a time that you get up, even if you don't have to have that right now, eat dinner and lunch at basically the same time. Like, just build a routine, because that structure makes a huge difference. And like it has, I wasn't doing that. I was sort of like, oh, work whenever, because nothing matters anymore and everything is meaningless. And yeah, that's made a huge difference, just in my energy levels and my mental outlook, all of that. It's been really helpful.
Yeah, I found dress up for the day. That's right. I got my bunny slippers on it. You just don't see it. I preach with them on too. Cooking together. My wife and I have taken to just picking out ingredients and being thoughtful about that. And once again, we talked about embodied practices. And I find that that's just been really just healing for us. We took her mother's recipe and we're working on it today. So we'll see. I'll let you know. The camarón soup, sopa de camarón, shrimp soup. And, we'll see how it goes out and goes forth. But I find that once again, those things, that are essential to our lives, both individually and collectively, I think many of us are just seeing that we're just doing them more mindfully. And I think that that's the grounding aspect for me. It's not that we're doing something so innovative and creative as is the American way, right? But it's returning to ourselves, returning to the essentials of even what it means to be church, what we were talking about before. Because I think that is probably my primary question. Like, what are the essentials? I think it was Phyllis Tickle. She was a sociologist. She talked about how every 500 years Christianity goes through kind of this rummage sale, and we hold on to what's most essential, and of course that differs across time, space, and culture. But it really has us thinking in this moment, like, what are the most essential things that we want to focus on, and then what are just things that just bring us like simple pleasures? Like, yeah, you're right, sitting down and watching a documentary with Myra and on Michael Jordan, and arguing about whether he was the GOAT or not, but really it isn't a documentary, right? That's just like a forum to get us like reconnected and engaged. And I think that that's something that we need to continue to be thinking about in the time of disconnection.
And I think those things make us feel human, don't they? It's like, I'm a human being. It's kind of like, I don't know how old your kids are, but like my kids are young. So I can remember when I was like a new mom, and like, I didn't feel like a human being for the first like 6 weeks or 8 weeks. I felt like, like a cow just feeding a kid, like I didn't feel like a human being.
Wow.
And so I think things like, that's why, like Easter, we set the table and we put out decoration, everything homemade, but like put out decoration, and the kids were like, oh, mama, who's coming? Because I'm a pastor. So we have people at our house 4 or 5 days a week, and it's been very traumatic for them because they went from being extremely social to like nothing, both with school and our literally 5 days a week we have people over. So, but we would have our friends drive by and stand outside on the porch and wave to them, and like just to kind of get, give them some. But for Easter, we set the table so nice that my son thought we were having like guests over. And I said, no, Papi, it's just for you. This is for you. Because today's a very important day, and we're celebrating the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and that God is with us. And so he was just we put on our suits for church, like we did all of it. And then on Friday nights, we've been doing movie nights, and I've been popping popcorn and like giving them, that's sugar day, they get candy, and we make pizza, and we just all the things that my parents did with me that I don't have time to do with them. And then the cooking, it's on, it's like I made homemade empanadas, I made arepas, I made a sancocho, I made like all the Colombian, what do you call it? Like comfort foods.
Yes.
And we grilled out, and like and all the stuff was kind of around. I mean, we made some, substitutions, but making meals an actual event again instead of like fuel.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's
I mean,
good.
the daytime's like whatever, a sandwich, but at night we've tried to like
having some time to I got a question from the chat. They wanted me to ask it, but I promise it's not mine. It's a good question. I'm not trying to like dodge credit for it. I just, credit where credit's due. So, asked, what am I learning and what I am learning and listening today is that we need to have more spiritual practices of shared power among believers for the privilege to give up power or the illusion of power. When we all depend on God's power, which is real power, it levels the playing field, puts us all in his kingdom life. So my question is, do you think that all spiritual practices are about recentering power?
Wow, that's a big question, and it's pretty profound. I would say that it's latently a part of it, but not the framing narrative of a spiritual practice. But if you think about Philippians 2, the practice of self-emptying, right? Jesus not considering himself, equal, emptying himself of his divinity and becoming a servant, right? And what spiritual practice is in many ways is, they're about not only bringing us back to our own humanity, our shared humanity, but it's also an act of faith, recognizing that there are certain actions that I can take that can actually channel the presence of God in both the momentous and also the mundane. So if spiritual practices are about submission on some level, that is also about a divestment of power as well. And so there are spiritual practices of, to Sandra's point earlier, listening to the global church, the 2/3 world church, and beyond. So I would say on some level, it does. But most of the way that society, unfortunately, is wired has to do with some sort of power story.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think it fundamentally has to do with us connecting, relating to, being in front of, showing our face to God, in that sense, showing up, in that sense, acknowledging that, very making space for any kind of spiritual practices, an acknowledgement that God is God, that we are not, and that God is trustworthy. So, whether it's silence and solitude, or giving, or service, or the pursuit of justice, or communal study of scripture. There's a handbook of spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines that InterVarsity Press puts out. It's a large blue book, but I think it's so helpful. It's like 20, maybe it's like 30 spiritual practices, and they categorize them in different ways, like all kinds of prayer and all. It's fantastic. But I think all of those really are about finding, reorienting and finding our identity in Christ, and remembering and reminding ourselves that we not only are made in God's image and not only serve a God of power, but that we are empowered by God's Spirit, which I think is a really missing from some of the majority church discussion in our country, but not around the world, that we are empowered people, that we carry with us. Jesus said to the disciples, you saw me do all these things, you'll do greater things, And I think that that's why, watching Anne of Green Gables and watching this little orphan girl, just tear up a town, I feel like that's the kind of power I believe. The answer doesn't come from a place of typically of political power. The revolution never comes from a center of power. It always comes from students, the poor, the marginalized. Like, if you look at history, revolution comes from the most unsuspected people. And the reason is because it's the people who have the most, who have oftentimes very little to lose in that sense. Like, if they risk themselves, it's like, what else? They're almost dying anyway. And they have the most to gain, and they're most impacted by that. So I think if you look at any revolution, modern revolution, you'll find it's young people and students. And in our neighborhoods, Jose, I don't know about you, but it's the grandmothers and the mothers with their months of fasting in front of a school and all the crazy things they do. And it's because they believe they have agency. And I think it's their life of prayer, their fundamental belief that God is present with them, and their theology of community that allows them to do that. So I think that the spiritual disciplines allow us to see ourselves rightly before God. We are created in God's image, and beautiful and creative and wonderful and fearfully made, as the scriptures say. and also in need of so much help.
Oh, wow.
And I think our spiritual disciplines help. Once we're in that place, then I think from a place of liberation and freedom, then we can have imagination and we can cause what I believe should be revolution in the world through the church. Complete overhaul of systems of evil. And how are you going to confront that without the power of the Holy Spirit? So I want to confront, I mean, I'm called to confront evil. So I'm going to be calling those ladies on Saturday mornings every time. Ladies, I'm going to stand up in front of a group of people who aren't going to like what I have to say. They're not going to flog me probably, but they definitely might, you know, attack me with their words. I'm very scared. I feel petrified. Will you please pray for me? And I can feel the weight of their prayer to say the things I need to say on behalf of the people in my community that are already speaking, and should be heard. So yeah, all of them are important. And I believe that the issue of power is interesting because the rummage sale analogy, I really like that from Phyllis. What's interesting is that historically there have been particular people in power who have told us what we ought to keep. And they're holding on to those same practices from the 1500s and the 1600s. And they're not allowing for there to be a liberation and a freedom in the church to choose practices that make sense for the church today. So either I think we're going to lose the next generation, or something alternative is going to be born out of it that will be outside of what is institutional church right now. I mean, look at our seminaries. They're literally set up to tell us these are the things that are acceptable. These are the beliefs that are acceptable. These are the books that are acceptable. These are the practices that are acceptable. And guess what? None of them are written by or voiced by anyone from your community.
That's right.
All right. Well, I have not seen any more questions. So maybe we could end by telling folks, if they do come across more questions, or the people who are not watching this live, hello to you also, and they do have a question or they want to engage in some way, how do we find us all on the internet? I'm very easy. I'm at JR Forasteros, anywhere that's worth finding me. If you find me somewhere else and I'm not that, I probably don't check that channel. So Twitter, Facebook, all that. Jose, how do we find you online?
Yeah, same. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Jose Humphreys. You can find me there.
Sandra?
You can also find Jose at Amazon with his book Seeing Jesus in East Harlem,
which is terrific.
What happens when churches show up and stay put. I highly recommend it. I highly endorse it. But yeah, Instagram is probably where I'm most active. So at Sandra Van Opstal.
And do you want to plug Chasing Justice again?
Oh, yes. Thank you. And at Chasing Justice _ I have a live today with Mark Reddy at 3:30 Central Time to share a little bit about what we're envisioning for the movement and why our logo is a lion. And we'll be live a couple times a week for the next couple of weeks until we figure something else out.
And Sandra also has a terrific book already out called The Next Worship. And how much are you sharing about your current book? Are you just writing it right now, or is there like a timeline or anything?
I don't know what the publisher has said publicly, so let me not talk about that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you don't. While you're waiting for the next book, you should definitely read The Next Worship. It's also really, really terrific, and it's already about re-envisioning church and a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today. So if you've been provoked by our conversation, I think both of their books would be tremendous helps at trying to imagine with your church congregation what's going to be coming next. So
okay, I just went on Amazon, so apparently they are already putting them up there. So InterVarsity Press is doing a series, 40 days on being, and then the number of the Enneagram. So there's 40 days on being each of the Enneagram types. Wow. So I'm doing 40 days on being an 8. So it's a devotional. It's a 40-day devotional for Enneagram 8s.
Where is that?
InterVarsity Press.
Okay.
Is that I assume it's like at the end of the 40 days in the wilderness and 8 just punches the devil when he comes to test you.
Yeah, we'll see how it ends up.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, this was kind of an experiment for us. We just wanted to get together and talk. So thanks for your engagement. Thanks for your questions. Please make sure you follow these two online and me if you want. But they're some of my favorite pastors. I love watching what they do in their churches and just getting to talk with them and see how their minds work as they dream about what's next for the kingdom. So hang in there. Stay distant, quit touching your faces, but we love all of you. And we're so grateful that we're in this together. So any final thoughts from either of you?
Thank you so much for having us, Jose. You know, I love you, brother. Praying for you guys.
Hey, likewise. I'm so blessed. Thank you for just the time, the energy, and just the wisdom that went into this, and also the laughs. I had some good laughs in this. It was beautiful. Thank you.
All right, we'll do something again in the future. Stay tuned. But again, thanks everyone. Grace and peace be with you. All right, we are clear.